Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Steve Ross, Director of the USC Casden Institute and Distinguished Professor of History at USC. And on behalf of the Casden Institute and the USC School of Cinematic Arts, I welcome you to today's discussion on the topic Antisemitism, Misinformation Warfare. How can we safeguard video games and social media platforms without violating the First Amendment? Today's online symposium will explore how anti-Jewish representations and misinformation have been used in the realm of digital media, including video games, either as an inadvertent byproduct of game development from mainstream publishers, or as a deliberate use of propaganda from international entities on independent platforms. Today's panelists will also discuss anti-Semitism in the in the realm of social media, meaning Facebook, LinkedIn, etc., and online forums, and how some companies don't follow their own regulatory guidelines. In addition, our panelists will analyze cyber psychology to identify common anti-Semitic tropes, and then provide us with some self-protective measures when it comes to social engineering, and with potential steps forward that must start within the Jewish community. Finally, our discussion will conclude by examining the challenges facing platforms and potential tools as to what can be done legally and ethically to safeguard games, social media, and other technology in ways that don't violate the First Amendment. And before I begin, I just want to mention today's format. I will introduce our moderator in a moment. The panelists he will introduce our panelists. They will talk for roughly an hour, and then we will have a Q&A with the audience. If you look at your Zoom feature, there is a chat box. If you enter in your question, I will compile them all and ask our panelists in the last 20 to 30 minutes what's on your mind. Well, it is now my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's event, Ross Berger, an adjunct assistant professor of cinematic writing at the USC School of Cinematic Arts. And Ross is a creative writer, narrative designer, and adjunct professor based in LA. He's the author of Dramatic Storytelling and Narrative Design, A Writer's Guide to Video Games and Transmedia, and he is the editor as well as a contributor to Storytelling for New Technologies and Platforms, A Writer's Guide to Theme Parks, Virtual Reality, Board Games, Virtual Assistants, and more. In addition, Ross has written for television. He's written for Law & Order and for the Webby Award-winning Lonely Girl 15, and he has served as a supervising producer for the social media television gaming experience, The Runner. Professor Berger has also written video games for Microsoft, Electronic Arts, Meta, and Niantic Labs. Welcome, Ross. I'll now turn the floor over to you to introduce our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ross, for the very kind introduction. I'm very excited to be here to discuss this topic, and I can't think of two more qualified people than Sarah and Jeff. Again, the title for today's webinar is Antisemitism, Misinformation, Information Warfare. How can we safeguard video games and social media platforms without violating First Amendment rights? So let's discuss those who are going to be contributing to this conversation. Sarah Katz is an author, screenwriter, and cybersecurity project manager at Microsoft. She's currently pursuing a PhD in cyber psychology at Capital Technology University. She's the author of such articles such as Back to the Tribe, Intersectionality Through Global Jewish Lens and Digital Earth, Cyber Threats, Privacy and Ethics in an Age of Paranoia. She's also the founder and president of Candid Bay Productions. Next, we have Jeff Helmreich. He's the Associate Professor of Philosophy of Law at University of California of Irvine, where he also serves as Director of Humanities and Law, the minor, as well as the co-director of the Center for Legal Philosophy. He is the author of numerous articles, most recently True Defamation, Against Harm, Keating, and on the Soul of Tort Law, Rights to Redress, which will be published in Palgrave Handbook on the Philosophy of Rights, which is forthcoming. Next slide, please. The structure of today's event, I'll be speaking for around 15 minutes. Sarah will then come in and discuss her topic for about 15 minutes. Mine will be about anti-Semitism, video games, and information warfare. Sarah will discuss anti-Semitism, social media, and online platforms. Then Jeff, for 15 minutes, will discuss the legal and ethical ramifications of safeguarding games and online platforms. And then for the final 30 minutes, we will have a Q&A. But before we begin, I just want to thank Lisa Ansell and the Casden Institute for making this important discussion possible. So let's dive in. Next slide, please. I'm sure all of you know that the video games industry is a massive industry. I don't want to go into all the details that I have here, but just some that might be pretty salient is there are nearly 3 billion gamers worldwide today. And by 2029, the industry will generate over $690 billion worldwide. I read in a similar study that the film industry won't even reach 100 billion by that same time. So the games industry greatly dwarfs film. It also outweighs revenues in film, music, and book publishing combined. And there are, like I said, 3 billion gamers worldwide today, or approaching that fact. So that basically means the reach is enormous. And the player time commitment to individual games is also enormous. 21% of adults between 18 and 29 spending 6 to 10 hours of gaming per week. Next slide, please. So just based on today's topic, I know information warfare might sound a little sinister, but I don't want to give you the impression the games industry is sinister or it's created to have deceptive purposes. It's not. Video games are meant to be played. They're meant to be fun. But sometimes they can be repurposed for objectives that are outside of entertainment. Next slide, please. That brings us to the topic of information warfare. I don't want to dive into this NATO definition. It's pretty extensive. Other entities have their own definitions, but it's pretty much accurate from entity to entity. But in short, information warfare comprises cyber warfare like malware, DDoS attacks, phishing schemes, and it also comprises, for the purposes of today's discussion, propaganda, how one nation or entity uses it against an adversarial country or entity. Next slide, please. There's a lot of different nomenclature that is synonymous to information warfare. More recently, there's something known as MDM, which stands for misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. Misinformation is false information that's spread regardless of whether there's an intent to mislead. Disinformation, deliberately misleading or biased information, manipulated narrative or facts. I also believe that disinformation is created to create a landscape or campaign of misperception through long-term suggestion, innuendo, and cherry-picked, decontextualized, overtly false information. And then there's a newer term known as malinformation, which is information that stems from the truth but is often exaggerated in a way that misleads and causes potential harm. Related terms you might hear along the way, and particularly in the last 15 years or even longer: propaganda, psyops, influence operations, psychological warfare, cognitive warfare, malign narrative, which refers to a lot of Russian propaganda. These are all very similar, if not synonymous, to the terminology as information warfare, at least in today's discussion, when it's the goal is for persuasion. Next slide, please. Historically, information warfare has been used through entertainment and media, again, through probably what is known as propaganda and radio warfare back in World War II. Illustration ads, even going back to World War I. Of course, there's been World War II propaganda films from the United States, UK, Soviet Union, and of course, the Nazi regime, Leni Riefenstahl movies being the most popular of those. And continuously fake newspaper articles where a military or a clandestine operation wants to create some degree of dissension in the ranks, and they will send some author to create some article that either maligns a leader or a regime in the country in which that article is found. So it does take various different forms that we've seen along the way, predating and concurrent with the usage of video games as a tool of information warfare. Next slide, please. But in video games, I also want to make one little slight distinction. When we talk about video games, when we say the word warfare, I don't want people to confuse it with war games, which is slightly different. War games are actually strategic games, strategy games that pit one player or team against another to simulate a hypothetical or historical act of conflict in the real world. war games are created to prepare a warfighting force for a potential engagement or conflict. That's not the same thing as, let's say, Call of Duty, which is a game that takes place in a combat zone. And two of the games I'll discuss later today are more in line with games that take place in a combat zone and are not the traditional way war games are defined. In addition to that, information warfare also isn't just about persuasion. Sometimes they can be used, the video game technology itself, not just the software. The hardware themselves has been used to coordinate hostilities. It's been used to surveil. It's been used to hack into other people's video games experiences to collect data on what they're doing. In terms of if it is a game like uh, anything like Pokemon Go or the like, where their technology, where they're going in their space to share their information with their friends, that information can be used to track in military installations or adversarial targets. Games like Pokemon Go, not necessarily that game specifically, but games like that, I should say, have been used for that data collection. Russia has done that in the war in Ukraine, in fact. But for the purposes of this, once again, I want to talk about persuasion, which has also been used as potentially to recruit and train a warfighting force, to promote and reinforce values, also a call to action, and also to demonize adversaries. Again, the list is not comprehensive as a persuasion tool, but these are some of the main targets or touchstones that a lot of video games as an information warfare product does. Next slide, please. So two countries that have used video games as a way to either persuade or to train. USA has done it with America's Army. Their goal primarily is to recruit and train for the US Army. Fortnite and esports games in the Navy have also been leveraged for recruiting efforts only. And the Air Force has done a lot of training modules in Second Life. The Department of Homeland Security, in fact, used Second Life, which is a digital presence, an MMO, to train people or to watchdog potential terrorist activity in Second Life. So it has been done for many different reasons by many different entities within the United States defense apparatus. Russia has used Minecraft, World of Tanks, and Roblox for anti-Ukraine propaganda and what they would call developing a malign narrative where they brand a country a certain way, such as Ukraine is known as a Nazi country, or the United States is known as a neo-colonialist country. So they do this to hammer away at certain players who are maybe outside of those war zones or outside of those Western alliances, to try to once again persuade them to go on their side of things. In a game called African Dawn, which is part of the Hearts of Iron series, they try to position, that is, the Russians try to position Americans as neo-colonialists and the Russians as the saviors of the world. Again, typical propaganda, but using video games to convey their malign narrative. Next slide, please. Countries aren't the only ones that use video games. Other entities include Hezbollah, and they've done it for 3 different video games. Their series known as Special Force, going back to 2003 until recently Holy Defense in 2018. The 2007 game, Tale of the Truthful Pledge, is about the IDF confrontation in the 2006 war. The 2018 game switches adversaries from the IDF onto ISIS. Hezbollah joins forces with the Assad regime to attack ISIS because they're considered apostasy. Next slide, please. Now, you might ask, in those games themselves, as you're playing them, there isn't necessarily something identifiable to the adversary, particularly in the second Holy Defense game, that is Jewish about the entities. You only know as soon as you go over the bodies that you've killed that there's a 6 Star of David on them to identify what country they're from primarily. Now, I can't say that so what does that mean exactly? Well, I try to look to Hassan Nasrallah, his belief system. Now, people might regard this information warfare as hostilities between Israel and Hezbollah, but just so we're clear, this is Hezbollah's actual agenda. Let me read those quotes to you again, things that he might have said in public or in the confidence of others. If you look all over the world, you will find No one more miserly or greedy than Jewish people are. If we search the entire world for a person more cowardly, despicable, weak, and feeble in psyche, mind, ideology, and religion, we will not find anyone like the Jew. Notice I do not say the Israeli. A quote from 2002. And Nasrallah and people as close lieutenants have made numerous references to Jews as grandsons of apes and pigs. These are statements of rage, bigotry, and degradation. Any piece of media and communication by Hezbollah thereafter is nothing but an attempt to fulfill this goal. Next slide, please. More recently, there was a game that came out in 2022 called Fursan Al-Aqsa, the Knights of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, independent developer based out of Brazil. And there were several updates, I shouldn't say two updates rather, in 2023 and 2024 that allowed players to reenact the Gaza war, choosing to play as either a Hamas or a Lion's Den militant. This game is filled with extreme violence, but that's par for the course for a first-person shooter game, which this genre is. The violence in this game, however, is more authentic to this conflict. Without saying more, I'm sure your imagination can go to those dark places. Next slide. Now, this game was removed by the UK in November of 2024 by their counterterrorism internet referral unit, and it was removed from the platform known as Steam, which is an independent game platform. Yet at the same time that this was removed, the game is still available in the US and Israel. And there are a couple disclaimers that the game creator wrote. You could see them on the lower part of the screen. The reason why the game was removed is because it was deemed as an act of encouragement of violence. One of the disclaimers says this does not promote terrorism, anti-Semitism, hate against Jews, or any other group. Can you move to the next slide, please? So the only reason why I included that game is because in this discussion, I didn't expect that type of game, which I strictly view as a political game. I don't view it as an extension of information warfare. And the reason why it kind of raised alarm is because an actual United Kingdom counterterrorism unit decided to remove it from the platform. But I don't think it qualifies, frankly, as an act of information warfare. However, next slide, please. If we separate information warfare and focus strictly on anti-Semitism, we don't have to look at the content of the game to raise suspicion of that, or or actually to have verification of anti-Semitism if the game itself creates or triggers some discussion on the comment section of the Steam platform about the game. If I draw your attention to the 4 different screenshots of comments that people have made, you can see that these aren't just anti-Semitic comments, they're also anti-American comments. Look at the middle one on top, it says, I rate this game, or I rate this 9 out of 11. Lower left, because I can do jihad, don't delete my account. I used to like juice. I don't like juice anymore. I don't believe juice in that context refers to something that you drink, which I think is pretty obvious. 10 out of 10 would play again. Just wish I could disable the Iron Dome. All these are either exact demonization of Jewish people or call to violence, direct call to violence. So that for itself, I believe this is the video game need not be a successful messenger of disinformation, or in this case, anti-Semitism, as long as it spurs enough interest and talk value on online gaming platforms or discussions forums like Reddit, Twitter, etc., where the disinformation or anti-Semitism can thrive. Next slide, please. On a related note to Steam, the ADL report, which came out 10 days before the UK firewalled that game on Steam. And once again, it was still available in the United States and Israel and across the world. The ADL came out with a report, coincidentally, about the Steam platform entitled Steam-Powered Hate, Top Gaming Site Rife with Extremism and Anti-Semitism. So the report doesn't tackle the content of the games, but rather the Steam channels and content and dialogue between Steam users on those channels. Next slide, please. So granted, there's so much that we can discuss about information warfare as either a tool for anti-Semitism or as a tool for pushing malign narratives or other kinds of narratives of adversarial nations. But why is it that it's potentially a very effective form of propaganda? Well, here's just some thoughts that I have. The visual imagery can reinforce loyalty to a cause or government, especially if that information is ongoing or continual within the stimuli experience of being in the being in the game journey. There are endless hours of playing a game. I showed you in that very first slide how many hours a typical gamer plays on a weekly basis. So just imagine constantly being reinforced with that visual imagery because you typically play 8 to 10 hours a week. Some players play 20 or more so hours a week. So the brand reinforcement and messaging can be reinforced on a regular basis. You also play, you can assume the role of an avatar, and that could be an aspirational experience. You are heroic. You are playing in the point of view of this person who is the assumption is they are the hero of their journey. Therefore, whatever they do is morally acceptable, again, within the moral universe of that particular game. Also, the guard is down when one is playing, therefore, players may not know they are being propagandized. And of course, just like we mentioned with Steam and other kinds of platforms, games can serve as a migratory force to social media and comments and game platforms where real discussion and exchange of ideas can occur. Next slide, please. Now, I don't want to leave this discussion without some type of conversation about what can we do in this particular case if there's propagandized materials coming through the games themselves or in the social media discussions part of the gaming experience. So as the industry grows, we have to be vigilant about the fringe corners of digital spaces. And excuse me, my recommendation is, and I've been in this situation before and working for game companies, you have to adopt certain cultural sensitivity best practices. Now, that's not a call for censorship. That's just a demand for fairness and greater authenticity of representation that requires education to teams that are devoted to what is known as product readiness or global compliance. Now, that terminology might change based upon the publisher, but these are the departments in the video game companies that prepare the product for dissemination worldwide. And some countries have different social and moral mores than the United States does. Like, for instance, if you're creating a Call of Duty game or a game that has takes place during World War II and your enemies are the Nazis, any kind of Nazi symbols are not allowed in Germany. So that content would have to be changed, redacted, or eliminated somehow. And in China, for instance, you can't have any representation of spirits rising from the dead or blood and bones being represented visually. So that kind of content we have to be aware of. Just because our game might seem awesome in the United States, those degrees of sensitivities might have to be changed depending on the country. Well, I think it goes internally as well, too. People have to be educated on more cultures, more religions, more ethno-religions, et cetera, and what might be offensive to certain groups, et cetera. When it comes to smaller venues or indie venues, I hate to say it, but hateful content will continue to endure. Public outcry will mitigate but not eliminate, but we must continue to educate those communities. And once again, if those independent entities have product readiness teams or global compliance teams or the equivalent, it's educating them in terms of what is anti-Semitic, what is potentially offensive to us. A lot of groups still believe anti-Semitism just means anti-religion, anti-Jewish religion, and some folks are unaware of deeper stereotypes that continue to pervade the world today. So again, that conversation has to be somewhat ongoing. I also say, I mentioned fairness beforehand. I think there is sometimes a notion of preferred speech on these platforms. A Taiwanese video game company in 2019 created a game called Devotion, which was removed entirely from the Steam platform because there was a knock against Chinese President Xi Jinping. And that game never returned to Steam after it was removed. It did return, but on its own website in 2022. So I can understand how a game could be firewalled on the respective countries by which its mores might be offended, but to have it completely firewalled or rejected from the entire platform itself, I feel like that conversation, if that's the rule from STEAM, then that has to be universally played based on country or underrepresented group, et cetera. So these are conversations I believe that need to be socialized globally as well as domestically to ensure that we're making the right decisions, though, so that it's not a call for censorship, but it is a call for fairness in terms of what is fair from our country versus other countries and adopting cultural sensitivity best practices, and also what is aligned with, in the United States, First Amendment conversations, First Amendment values, which Jeff will discuss in a little bit later. Next slide, please. So that's pretty much from my discussion. Again, a very large topic, not so much, there's so much to discuss within this, but I'm excited for Sarah's part of the conversation, her discussion on online platforms, very much related to what I'm talking about now, but in a different scale that is probably even more persuasive just based upon numerous different channels that are out there for social media. So with that said, Sarah, take it away.
Excellent, Ross. Thank you so much. Do we happen to have the slides available? Here we go. All right. So this will basically discuss how anti-Zionism enables anti-Semitism on social media. Next slide, please. So we have definitely heard a lot, especially since October 7th, 2023, how anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are either completely different or only tangentially related. And the reason that this discussion is important, particularly today, is because we have an extremely large number of folks on social media. At this point, we are estimating that many folks who have any type of internet access are probably using social media at this point. And the AJC has recently reported that unfortunately 62% of American Jews have either reported seeing or hearing anti-Semitic content online or on social media. Next slide, please. All right, going forth, the term Islamists will be used to refer to those who believe in Islamic hegemony and pan-Arabism. So it's more in a political context, as opposed to trying to say anything about Muslim people as a whole. Next slide, please. All right, so as we have definitely seen with the countless protests since the start of the most recent war in Gaza, we have definitely seen a wealth of inflammatory content across social media that is both definitely demonstrating Israel as hyper powerful, and by extension, a lot of the time we see that tends to bleed into trying to make the same claim about Jews as a whole. Next slide, please. All right, so in particular, due to the social justice opposition to colonization and decolonization efforts, particularly within the past 10 years or so, there has been a specific focus on Ashkenazi Jews. These being both the majority of Jews in the United States and also the diaspora branch that is most closely associated with Europe. So there has arisen this racialized binary, almost as white oppressor versus non-white victim, and the conflation of diaspora history in Europe with undue privilege. And unfortunately, certain entities, a whole wealth of entities really, have taken to social media to spread this ideology. There has also come along with that a very, very strong effort to divorce really Jews as a whole, but specifically Ashkenazim from the whole region of Israel and Palestine at large. Next slide, please. All right, so these slides are going to go a bit more quickly. I apologize. Some of them are a bit blurry, but these are examples from social media in the wild. So these are pretty strong demonstrations of recurring ad nauseum terms we tend to see. Israel is a Zionist colony, specifically of Ashkenazi Jews or of Zionists, which is ironic because actually today's population in Israel are mostly non-Ashkenazi Jews, and they are actually Jews whose ancestors have never left the Middle East, but people either tend to gloss over that, or they tend to say that all non-Ashkenazim are puppeteered by Ashkenazim in the US, and it's just like, yes. Next slide, please. We'll get into a little more of that. All right, so this is pretty much your basic Twitter/X example. This is interesting because this kind of conflates the whole white Ashkenazim versus non-white other with a rather more classic anti-Semitic Holocaust denial trope. So I found this example to be pretty interesting. So this one is obviously suggesting that Ashkenazim either outright created the Holocaust or lied about it. Next slide, please. All right, my apologies. This is a little tiny. But this one is from Instagram, and this tends to dig down more into the genetic/eugenics argument, again, specifically focusing on Ashkenazim, because that tends to be an obsession for this ideology. It tends to try and frame the concept of Jewish roots in Israel in terms of a scientific issue and one that can be proven. And unfortunately, a lot of Jews themselves are falling for it. Next slide, please. All right, now, among many of the Jews who are falling for it, unfortunately, I have witnessed many folks across all the major social media platforms, from LinkedIn to Reddit to X to Facebook. Unfortunately, a lot of folks, Jews included, tend to think that these inflammatory comments are created by bots. And as Ross was discussing, a lot of folks assume it's Russian bots. While I don't doubt that bot activity is a huge problem, especially as someone who works in cybersecurity as well, these ideologies are definitely not spread only by bots. They are flesh and blood human beings, and a lot of them who have a lot of feelings who you have to pay attention to. And you can definitely see this on platforms such as LinkedIn, which is obviously not only a social media platform, it's a professional social networking platform. And so the users there are tend to be more vetted, and we see a lot of this type of activity across LinkedIn. So definitely many more inflammatory conversations than you might expect to see folks participating in where their employers might witness. Next slide, please. All right, so this is just a fun little personal example that I had here. So for those of you who don't know, my last name, Katz, is an acronym. It was originally shortened in diaspora in order to blend in or assimilate. But Katz is also the German word for cat. And so this lovely person saw my name commenting on a photo of the city Haifa in Israel, and they said what they said. And so this is a very, I think, kind of clear example of how basically our diaspora surnames have unfortunately become a way for a lot of folks to attack us. Now, do we have to listen to them? Absolutely not. But with enough of this activity, it can be quite cumbersome. Next slide, please. All right, so this was very interesting, and I was happy to actually be able to capture the whole process here. So it's long been a trope against Jews and probably a lot of other groups as well to be compared to vermin, insects, rodents, just like anything like that. And Facebook, in particular, has a policy against this. Now, as a platform with both human and AI moderators, you would expect there to be some nuance. Unfortunately, in this situation, you can't even blame it on a lack of nuance because the policies here specifically state under their community standards that you can't compare any group of people, whether racial, ethnic, religious, what have you, to insects, well, animals, insects, it's specifically cockroaches. And this was a comment that actually arose in a conversation I was having where they discuss Jews reproducing like cockroaches. And Facebook did not find an issue with that. So that was a little good example from the wild. Next slide, please. All right, so returning back to the discussion of how contemporary anti-Semitism that has started to arise on the far left tends to tie back into the type that we see from the far right. The difference that we tend to see with the far left is that they still tend to frame Jews as hyper powerful, but the emotional appeal is quite stronger. So obviously, in the modern day, because obviously far right anti-Semitism and bigotry in general has thankfully become a lot more fringe than it once was, of course. Far left anti-Zionism tends to be a little more insidious in how it can cross over into anti-Semitism, and we see that a lot, specifically with the conflation of Jews with colonization of BIPOC people in the West. We see that, and we just tend to see an overall conflation of just Jewish privilege, and all of this has really, really increased a lot since October 7th. Next slide, please. All right, so here's where we really dig down into why the opposition to Jewish self-determination in the Middle East is so important here. And it's because it's fundamentally opposed by Islamism and Arab nationalism, due to the view that any non-Islamic self-determination is a threat. And unfortunately, because there's this view in the West that tends to infantilize groups who are not of European background, there tends to be a great deal of assumption that the people with the power, or in this case, Jews, and specifically Ashkenazi Jews, who are viewed as more associated with colonial Europe, are the ones in the wrong. So it creates this moral black and white binary, so to speak. Next slide, please. All right, here we go. Returning also to what Ross was saying a bit. Okay, so I would say personally that as someone who works in cybersecurity specifically, my tip to the Jewish community, especially during the current war, would be extremely careful around any emails or social media messages or text messages that you might receive that claim to be supportive of Israel or the Jewish community, that might talk about the hostages and the war, anything like that. Don't click on any links until you preferably verify with the sender. But even more importantly, would definitely suggest that if the email seems to come from a recognized organization, contact that organization separately just to verify that they're actually meaning to contact you. Next slide, please. All right, and leading into Jeff's presentation, what are some ways that we can help combat anti-Semitism on social media without infringing upon free speech? All right, so first and foremost, it has to come from within the Jewish community. There has definitely been a lot of, I like to call it Jewish white guilt. There are a lot of Jewish people in the West, in America specifically, who, because they themselves haven't, fortunately, haven't had personal experience with persecution or oppression, maybe, they tend to believe this ideology that they are hyper powerful, hyper privileged, and basically they're the problem. So it is very possible to support Palestinian rights, and I do most definitely, but also not conflate even just Israel or Jews as a whole, preferably both. There's no reason to have to label either as hyper powerful or like the enemy or the perpetrator, anything like that. We also should practice caution when calling out anti-Semitism. So, for instance, there was the ceasefire petition that was signed by many, many celebrities towards the start of the current war in Gaza. And there were a lot in the Jewish community who were calling that anti-Semitic. And while I definitely understand the knee-jerk reaction to that, for sure, the actual petition also calls for the release of the Israeli hostages. So we want to be careful there that we're not just assuming that everyone's against us, because it's important to not appear that we have a victim complex. Because if we do, then it kind of just looks like we're crying wolf, and nuance is extremely important. Next slide, please. All right, and in case you have any questions about any of the content or the claims made, here are the references for the presentation, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. All right, Jeff.
Hi, I'm Jeff Helmreich, Associate Professor of Philosophy and Law at University of California, Irvine. I want to thank Ross Berger and Sarah Katz for their insightful framing of the discussion. I want to thank the Casden Institute, Lisa Ansel and Steve Ross and the others for enabling this conversation, and all of you for coming. I'm going to try and run through this a little quicker than the others just so we have time for questions. So my title is Banishing Bias, Free Speech and Anti-Semitism in Online Spaces, and I will be discussing in particular how we deal with the struggle against bias and hate online while not crossing the line set by the First Amendment and the principles behind it of free speech. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. The title Banishing Bias is a bit of a double entendre, as you might notice. It both connotes the notion of the attempt to banish bias, to banish hate from online spaces, to banish toxicity from online spaces, but it also denotes a kind of bias, the kind that is banishing. And that's not coincidental. What I'm here to argue in the end is that the kind of bias we can most successfully exclude, despite the First Amendment, is in fact the kind that excludes. The kind of bias we could banish is the kind of bias that banishes, the kind that doesn't merely make a point, but that actually serves to crowd out and exclude people from certain spaces. But that's not going to be immediately obvious, because first we need to make clear what is anti-Semitism when we talk about online anti-Semitism. What exactly do we mean by it? It is actually an extremely contested and difficult issue today. That is, even as we speak, there are new legislative initiatives being adopted that are using definitions that are counter to what others have been using. It's a very important, very controversial issue. So we have to get clear on what is anti-Semitism. We also have to get clear on what exactly the First Amendment and the free speech principles, which we all believe in, a lot of us believe in, what do they in fact aim to protect? And finally, how is it that certain forms of anti-Semitism lie outside the scope of that protection? And in particular, how does that apply to online forms of anti-Semitism that we might want to try to regulate and try to control? Next slide, please. The title here says, by the way, two kinds of anti-Semitism. What I mean to say, two opposing views of what anti-Semitism is. But there's the view that's the classical view, the orthodox view of what anti-Semitism is largely a doctrinal view. This goes more generally to the classic view of what racism is in race theory, the theories about what bigotry is. It's largely doctrinal, by which I mean it's a view about, or rather, it characterizes bigotry or hate speech in terms of something that is believed by the haters or believed by the bigots. So a doctrinal view of anti-Semitism will hold that Jews are greedy or miserly, as in one of the quotes that Ross used, will hold that Jews are responsible for this and that, or that they're part of a global network. And this is the classic view, goes back to the Enlightenment. Thinkers who are otherwise progressive thinkers during the Enlightenment had views about different races and classes in the world, pseudoscientific views about how ethnicity subordinates and how ethnicity creates a stratification of peoples and of ethnicities and of tribes across the world. Going all the way to the Nazi period, in which there were pseudoscientific views about what Jewish ethnicity and Jewish genes do to the Jewish psyche and so on and so forth. So there's a long pedigree of the doctrinal view of hate and anti-Semitism, which again links it to a certain belief. It is largely adopted today by the Anti-Defamation League. The ADL uses a doctrinal view, describes anti-Semitism as acting on certain stereotypes. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which many others have used, also regards it as a perception. Anti-Semitism is perceiving Jews a certain way. And again, so it's very influential, the doctrinal view, but it's not the only view. So next slide, please. So as an alternative to the doctrinal view of anti-Semitism, I want to pose the attitudinal view, which more recently some organizations have adopted. The attitudinal or stance view of anti-Semitism and of bigotry more generally argues that it's not a belief. You don't have to think anything of the target of your bigotry or anti-Semitism. It's an orientation or a stance against a certain group. So if you are anti-Semitic, you are against Jews in a certain way. You're negatively inclined towards Jews. If you're against blacks, you're negatively inclined towards them, which means you're inclined to disparage them in your speech, to act against them in your behavior, and to discriminate against them. And what's interesting about the attitudinal view is, and I think what's advantageous about it, is that it doesn't theorize the anti-Semite. It doesn't presuppose certain things that they think, certain scientific beliefs, in particular, a lot of cartoonish ones that most people today who you would regard as anti-Semites, who I would very easily refute. So the attitudinal view can be simply a view that regards Jews as a rival or as a competitor, or even one that jealously admires them. It doesn't have to be a view that saddles the anti-Semite with any particular beliefs, claims, opinions about Jews. Next slide, please. As I started to say, as you can tell, probably by the way I'm saying it, if you look at the differences between the doctrinal and the attitudinal view of anti-Semitism, I think you can see pretty quickly the advantages of adopting the attitudinal view. In part, it includes everything that the doctrinal view includes, right? So most of the negative, disparaging things you say about Jews or about minorities in general will be things you're saying out of animus, out of a negative stance toward them. But it also includes things I think we all agree we want to include in terms of describing anti-Semitism, but which the doctrinal view leaves out. In particular, if somebody who simply hates Jews or hates blacks or hates whatever, somebody hates a certain minority or is against a minority or regards them, they should not replace us, they should not take over our pure white space, or they should, there's this land, if you're in another part of the world, is not big enough for both of us, Jews have to be banished. This is, as somebody who hates Jews or is opposed to Jews at every turn, as someone we would indisputably call an anti-Semite. But notice, it doesn't presuppose any factual opinion about Jews, who they are, what they do. And that, I think, is just a pretty devastating counterexample to the doctrinal view, and suggests that despite that is the orthodox view and is the one adopted by most organizations against anti-Semitism, I think is pretty clearly the wrong view, and it's a view that we should reject. Another consequence of that, two consequences that are relevant, is that opposition to Israel or Zionism laid out on paper as a doctrine or as a belief is pretty easy to refute in terms of whether it's anti-Semitic. Pretty clearly, it's not on its face targeting Jews or about Jews necessarily. You could take any view that's ever been said about Israel, and I can find you a non-anti-Semitic Jew or Jewish leader who has adopted it at some point, who everyone would agree is non-anti-Semitic. But when you switch to the attitudinal view, you can see much more clearly why statements about Israel or about Zionists or about Zog or what have you are actually quite clearly anti-Semitic, because they are statements used as a manifestation of a negative disposition toward or orientation toward Jews. So that's one consequence of taking the attitudinal view. Another, of course, is that it doesn't link anti-Semitism to an opinion about the truth of the world, which, as it turns out, is exactly what the First Amendment aims to protect. So next slide, please. So what is the First Amendment ultimately after? So the free speech principles behind it come most prominently from John Stuart Mill, the philosopher John Stuart Mill, who argued that in order for a society to know the truth about things, anything, whether it's science, morality, values, every candidate for what the truth is needs to be both available to all of us to consider and run to the scrutiny and the test of opposing views, which means basically that no view about the truth of any kind of truth, whether it's a normative truth about what ought to be, descriptive truth about what is, a historical truth, a legal, no truth ought to be banished from the discussion. By the way, it's not only a legal principle, it's a principle that applies more generally to platforms. It's a principle that most of us tend to, I've seen forums that have nothing to do with the law will say, well, free speech, I can't just kick this person out, or I can't just silence that person. And the idea behind it is that we don't want to forcibly banish an idea from consideration. Notice then that the paradigm thing that First Amendment protects is opinions about the truth of something, whether it's an evaluative opinion about what's good or a factual opinion about what is. Next slide, please. Now, ironically, despite the broadness, sometimes almost every other country in the world has considered overbroadness of John Stuart Mill's conception, the conception the framers had in the Constitution for adopting First Amendment protection. Nevertheless, most of what we prohibit in this world, short of actual physical violence, is manifest through speech. Most of what we criminalize is done by way of communication. When we threaten people, when we blackmail them, when we plot to commit an assassination or a bank robbery, when we conspire to fix prices, when we spill secrets that we're not supposed to, when we threaten to spill secrets that will be damning to others. I say, give me all your money, or if I say, do this or I'll shoot. Pretty much most things that we criminalize and prohibit are speech, and not just things that incidentally involve speech, things we do through speech, actions, sometimes called performative utterances that we perform through speech. So that raises the obvious question, which is, what's the difference? What in particular individuates the speech that we consider sacrosanct beyond restriction of any kind and regulation? And what is the speech that we already see uncontroversially is regulable, is criminalizable, is prohibitable? Yeah. To that, I think one of the most influential, I think most persuasive views was held by Kent Greenawalt, the late Columbia University legal philosopher, who categorized the kind of speech that we do criminalize and prohibit as what he called situation-altering utterances. Basically, speech that is really more action than speech. It's not primarily about expressing an opinion. It's really about changing the situation between people, in which it is only incidental communication is being used. You can re-describe situation-altering utterances as action with no loss of meaning. So if I say, you're fired, you're hired, if I say, or if I say, you're not allowed here, or I won't sell to you, many of the things that we say can be redescribed as a firing or a hiring or a banishing or an exclusion of some sort or a discrimination of some sort. We can describe a lot of speech, a threat, a blackmail. We can describe a lot of speech as action, and it's only incidental that a point of view or a thought is being expressed to those actions. And that makes it so basically it's more action than speech. It's only incidental that speech is involved. And that kind of utterance is almost universally, uncontroversially bannable, prohibitable, restrictable, criminalizable. Next slide, please. And the problem with that distinction is that on the surface, at least, it doesn't help us with anti-Semitism or bigotry, because we are precisely outraged by anti-Semitism and bigotry precisely because of the view that it expresses. So here I'm saying anything that's not really about expressing a point of view, we don't have to worry about. But on the other hand, this whole conversation is about anti-Semitism, bigotry, something whose primary point seems to be to express a point of view. So how does Greenwald's idea help us? Clearly, an action like "No Jews Allowed," certain country clubs used to have, or even recently in some countries they tried to ban Jews from games like interactive games like Roblox during the weeks and months following October 7th. Out of solidarity with Palestinians, if you ban people, if you kick them out, or if you have a policy against Jews that you express with words, that's obviously going to be more action than speech. It's going to fit a situation-altering utterance category, and it will be fine. But we're talking here, and Sarah was talking very movingly about websites in which, or social media sites in which you have hate-filled and vitriol against Jews. And how does this help us with that? How does this help us with restricting or protecting against that, which does seem to be about expressing point of view? So next slide, please. With the case of pornography, there was a strategy to deal with this challenge. And it's interesting, it's instructive about the present case, even though it didn't ultimately work. The feminist theorist Catherine McKinnon argued that pornography is problematic because of the content, problematic because of the way it subordinates and discriminates against women. But it shouldn't be targeted by the First Amendment, shouldn't be targeted by First Amendment jurisprudence, because pornography isn't really speech in the first place. It doesn't communicate by expression. It doesn't communicate by persuasion. It actually, in effect, injects the audience with the discriminatory viewpoint as if by a pill, as if by a needle. It does so because pornography, as she argues, works by arousal, not by argument. As she famously put it, if you think an orgasm is an argument, try arguing with one. The idea being that it's outside the realm of speech if it communicates, or if the discriminatory idea is spread through some other method besides persuasion. But why didn't this work in the end? Ultimately, it was struck down by the Seventh Circuit when she used this idea to try and ban pornographic media in Indianapolis. It was struck down by the Seventh Circuit because the conservative Judge Easterbrook argued, at the end of the day, she's saying the problem with pornography is what it expresses, what it represents, what it says about women. And again, the primary aim of the First Amendment is to restrict speech, is to protect speech that is targeted because of what it says. Next slide, please. This, however, suggests, let's move to the next one. Next slide, please. This suggests that had Catherine McKinnon, had the anti-pornography movement tried to restrict pornography as discrimination, but not in virtue of what it depicted, but simply as an act of discrimination, they might have been more successful. That's an implication, at least, of the decision that ultimately struck it down. And we do have other means in our law and in civil rights litigation in particular, and in other exceptions to free speech, that suggest that sometimes even the content of speech might be a way, or the content of hate might be a way of doing more than speech. The fighting words doctrine in particular talks about when speech which was insulting and taunting was criminalizable, it was because it was actually used as a way of making a space uninhabitable for the audience. The person being targeted with the taunts and the slurs and the harassment was effectively banished from the space in which they were in. It was a situation where if you're exposed to that speech, any reasonable person would have to either leave the space or fight. They'd have to either flight or fight. And that's a way, think about it in the more recent context of following Jewish students to their classrooms on a campus and taunting them with slurs, effectively chasing them with words. That's considered different from expressing a point of view, from advocacy and from argument. That's effectively banishing people from a space. And under the fighting words doctrine, that's prohibitable. Similarly, in hostile environment harassment, when a workplace is considered so saturated, so pervaded by haranguing hateful comments against a minority, against a woman, against a Jew, against a Black, to the point that it becomes a condition of working there, and you can't participate in that space as an equal participant. That too is considered a way in which it's no longer advocacy or argument, it's now using speech to render a place inhospitable to certain groups. And that too is a way in which speech, even though despite the fact that its content is what matters, speech becomes a way of being more than advocacy. It's a form of exclusion. And hate speech in this way can do that, can make an environment inhospitable to certain people. Next slide, please. So we can see how this applies to Jews in online spaces. If a social media site or a game targeting, let's say, people with Jewish stars that you're shooting the whole time, or if comments and tweets are just coming at you all the time because of because of your having a certain protected identity, you could very plausibly make the argument that this space has become effectively inhospitable or uninhabitable, or far less hospitable and habitable if you're from my particular identity. With Jews, that would mean, again, filling a space with anti-Semitic vitriol to the point that they cannot participate equally in it. That's a form of banishment, not a form of argument. Next slide, please. So all of this suggests that if we're going to target speech, anti-Semitic speech online, it should not be in virtue of what it argues or what it says or the claim that we find offensive, but as making a condition of participation in that space simply inhospitable to Jews, inhospitable. And notice that on the attitudinal view of anti-Semitism, it doesn't have to say anything about Jews to do that. It could target, as frequent online forum now do, it could talk about the United Slaves of Israel, or about Zog or Zogbots. And all of these are about the globalist Zionist agenda, or about Soros mixed with Epstein, mixed with AIPAC and other groups, all clearly manifesting anti-Jewish animus, even if the specific content is narrower. And all of this is a way of making a place simply inhospitable or simply no longer inclusive on an equal footing of Jews. That is a strategy. That is discrimination. It's no longer speech. It can even be the grounds of a lawsuit. And I think it's wise to adopt this strategy and this approach, target speech that excludes, that banishes, not speech that merely makes a claim. I think that's the most fruitful strategy for combating anti-Semitism, not only online, but in general. Thanks very much. That's it for me.
Thank you, Jeff. Professor Ross, I think that brings us to the Q&A section. Were there any questions that you came across that you'd like to ask us?
Well, there are a few, and then I would encourage you all to have a conversation. The first is there any website that identifies video games that are notably and clearly anti-Semitic?
There is no website in particular. Again, the ADL report, which discusses Steam, through that as a byproduct of the report itself, and maybe deeper into the ADL site, you'll be able to find things. If you actually go on Reddit, sometimes you'll be able to find people to identify those things, but there isn't a watchdog site devoted to anti-Semitic products in video game space.
So if
It's not that I
parents
know of.
wanted to find out about the content of the games their kids were playing, there is no place to really find that out?
That is correct. I mean, you would have to stumble organically upon discussion groups to see what other players are saying.
All right. And Sarah, question for you. In one of your slides, what did you mean by saying we could use experts to manually train automation to recognize more nuanced anti-Semitic content on social media platforms? How do we manually train automation?
Perfect. So I actually worked as a content moderator for Facebook during the Russian presidential election interference back in 2016. And at that time, content moderation was pretty much completely human. But obviously now it's become largely automated, but we definitely still need humans overseeing the process. And specifically when it comes to hate against specific groups, organizations really need to make sure that they are employing people who have a well-rounded view of those communities and are preferably part of those communities. So, for instance, it would probably entail something like human moderators who are able to distinguish between criticism of Israel and calls for the outright destruction of the state of Israel, or calling for the destruction of Jews as a group, and stuff like that.
I have a question for Jeff and the panel, but Jeff, I'll start with you. And that is, in the aftermath of October 7th, when the congressional hearings were happening about anti-Semitism, and we had our 3 university presidents all testifying, I believe they taught, and I could be wrong, so tell me if I've got the nuance incorrect, that in terms of what constitutes hate speech, one of the things that was argued is the law says if you call for harm to somebody far away, so if I'm sitting at the USC campus and I say, you know, I hope either all of Israelis or all of the Palestinians die in this conflict, either way, that harm several thousand miles away, that you can get away with that. But if you call for harm to people demonstrating on your campus in the immediate area, you are that constitutes, in fact, hate speech because somebody in the immediate area is endangered. Does this also hold true to video games? First of all, did I get that correct legally? And if I did, would it hold true for video games?
So I would put it slightly differently. There's a different question of, are you allowed to do it, and is it hate speech? I think it's uncontroversially accepted that both calling for harm far away and calling for harm close by are hate speech. Most people who think that hate speech, who believe in free speech protection, don't deny that hate speech is hate speech. They just think that sometimes hate speech should be protected. And so in Brandenburg versus Ohio, you have what's called the imminent lawful harm test, which is exactly the test that you're alluding to, which says that if I call for the destruction of the Mexican state out of animus towards Mexicans, God forbid, that's clearly hate speech. I mean, no one would deny it's hate speech. I just can't, the First Amendment simply protects my right to say. Pretty much all believers in the First Amendment believe that it protects hate speech. They don't believe that what it protects is outside the category of hate speech. But yes, if I call, in order for it to be criminalizable hate speech, as opposed to protected hate speech, I have to say, go and harm that person over there. And often they'll even require that I say how. Like if I just say, stop the Zionist occupiers on that part of campus, but I don't say stop them, with this bat over here, or stop them by punching them. If I just say stop them, or those are the people that we're talking about, even then it would be a little bit hard to get legal protection, to get legal criminalization of that. So you have to be very specific. It has to be basically instructing people to do violence. For it to now with video games, I think the same distinction would apply. If the video game is a way of training people to, or of reinforcing people's ability to carry out violent acts, I think that's a much more immediate causal discriminatory action that's not going to count as hate speech or merely hate speech. But if you're simply on a game or in another forum saying, let's bring about one day, God willing, the elimination of all Jews in Israel, or the de-Zionization of Israel, that's not going to be in any way restrictable, unless, like I said, it makes the space into a hostile environment.
If I can jump in here for a second too, it's in 2015, the Paris attacks were thought to have been coordinated through the usage of the PlayStation, where various different militants were talking with each other with a communication function within the PlayStation 3, I believe, at the time. Now, that was later debunked by French law enforcement, but the fact that the technology itself, which I referenced earlier in my presentation, is not necessarily the content of the software, but the actual technological capabilities that allows for coordination of hostilities. I believe in that case, that would not be protected speech, right? Right, Jeff? Even though that would be an actual call to action. And in video,
once you're instructing and
yeah, yeah, so the technology can be used in that effort, again, outside of speech, because the content is already baked into the disk itself.
a useful way is that if you're instructing and directing violence, you are no longer protected speech. If you're merely calling for it or advocating it, you're still in your hate, but it's protected hate.
How then, on the early statistics, so much of it showed that it was younger people going on for gaming. So what, for example, I believe our audience is probably largely over 29. So if you are trying to monitor kids, your own kids, either your children or your grandchildren, and you're not someone likely to go online to play the games, what do parents do then? What would be your advice?
I mean, that a lot of it has to do with trust with your kid and having access to the games themselves and assuring how many hours they're playing per day. And if you feel they're going into dark places in the digital corners of video games, et cetera, and this also I would imagine extend to social media, that you have firewalled systems. I mean, manual systems where you take the game control out of their hand to assure they're not going to go to a place that you think might be dangerous for them. It's about having an ongoing conversation with your kid and making sure your kid feels that if they're in a dark place, that they can share that with their parent. I would have that conversation first with the kid before they start gaming. Because if there isn't, then there's almost like a quiet acquiescence that I'm just going to go forth in this. I don't have any accountability in terms of what I experienced, and that's okay. I think I am mature enough and secure enough to endure whatever's thrown my way from a vitriol and rhetoric perspective.
At this point, we've answered the audience questions, although I invite anyone in the audience to put something in. Do you have questions for each other?
Jeff, let me ask you a question about the latter part. The hostile work environment was very interesting, as you mentioned. Sarah addressed it upon it too. I was just being immersed in the social media world of nothing but hostility. Unpack that a little bit more for us in terms of what can be done from a legal perspective, both in games and social media. How does the hostile work environment, how can that be applied beyond, I guess, just theory at this point?
Well, it hasn't yet, but this is a new frontier. So this is the conversation at this stage has to be about potential legal mechanisms that bear promise, that they're promising, but they haven't yet been utilized in this way. So a hostile work environment classically is about discrimination in the workplace, right? It hasn't been used yet in other contexts. But if you look at what both the hostile work environment and the fighting words doctrine amount to, they amount to redescribing what at first glance looks like speech, insults, epithets, what have you, is redescribing it as something that ultimately transforms the experience of being in a certain space. It transforms an environment. It transforms a workplace or a club or a product. It transforms it into something that is essentially discriminatory, that bars certain people from participating in equal footing, makes it inhospitable to those people. So the idea is that since that is not about opinion or argument, that's about an act of discrimination, applying that to a social media site makes sense. It makes sense logically. It makes sense of the principles behind the First Amendment and the principles behind when we don't apply the First Amendment. So that's why it hasn't been applied yet to games. But the suggestion is that since these are other contexts in which First Amendment has been considered less relevant, less applicable, it's likely to be the kinds of strategy that I think will work and can work even before we get to the law. If you tell a game maker or a Steam type type host, this particular platform, this particular game, this particular site is inhospitable. You've rendered it inhospitable to certain minorities. It's inhospitable to Jews. That will already impose at least some pressure in a way that's merely saying this says the following about Israel on this site, or someone said this against Jews. That's not going to impose the same kind of pressure. So that's
what about a reinforcing mechanism? I mean, Sarah went through that in one of her slides. She mentioned the comparing a group to an animal and an insect, which goes against the community standards of, let's say, Facebook or whatever the social media platform was, and yet it fell on complete inaction as a result of whomever that host was. Is this also a battle not just in terms of creating legality for this, but also creating accountability for those who are hosting folks on those platforms? I mean, maybe this is beyond this conversation, but I mean, how to basically encourage enforceability of community standards seems like almost an insurmountable task. And maybe that's a question for you, Jeff, and for Sarah as well.
Sarah, did you want to?
Yeah, I would say that we have a long way to go in terms of knowing what type of nuance is required when. And I do support the automation route, obviously, because with the extraordinary amount of content that is introduced to these platforms every minute of every day, can't really, unfortunately, expect humans to moderate all of it. But we do definitely, I think, have to know when to defer to human moderators when certain content appears. And I would say that probably a starting point for that would be some manner of a predefined lexicon of terms that come up. Zionist is a big one, obviously, with how often you see that term nowadays. That also might have to be also automated pretty soon. But I'd say at this point in time, it would probably help to always have a set of human eyes on it.
So can you walk us through in terms of what would it be, a potentially shadow banning of the person who says a series of epithets against a group, or a muting of it and they just don't know it, or is an actual removal of that content altogether, wherein if they're in the middle of a discussion, that comment, because it's removed, might make the conversation look disjointed or unclear? Walk us through in terms of how that would potentially work.
Right, that's a great question. So I would say that shadow banning would probably work, yes. Probably better than the removal, because you don't want any of that context lost. Because if someone angrily reacts to something inflammatory that someone else said, and then the person who made the inflammatory comment, if their content is then removed, it might look like the person who is responding. For instance, if it's a Jew defending themselves, then it might appear that they're the ones being inflammatory. And so you definitely have to see that context. That being said, I don't necessarily think that you need to even shadow ban someone unless they're actually, like, as Jeff was discussing, instructing on how to carry out the oppression or the violence.
Well, let me ask the last question we have from the audience, which is, I believe there has been efforts to make hate speech illegal on the part of organizations such as the Simon Wiesenthal Center. How do those efforts get around the First Amendment?
From my point of view, it's the big question of how does hate speech, how can you criminalize hate speech in light of the First Amendment? And again, it has to be by targeting something about the speech other than the point of view it is trying to advocate. Now, that's not to say that this won't change in this country. There are philosophers like Jeremy Waldron NYU and Catherine McKinney and others, especially those outside the U.S., who have argued that the U.S. is over restrictive when it comes to, over permissive with First Amendment, and that we have to relax the First Amendment scrutiny to make room for bans on hate speech. But under the current legal regime, hate speech that is targeted because it is creating discriminatory conditions, or because it is creating a hostile environment, or because it is creating a fighting words situation where people cannot simply endure it standing in that space, or hate speech because it is an action like you're fired or you're not welcome here. That is the kind of hate speech that can be at the moment targeted and restricted legally, whereas hate speech, even the most extreme, talking about cockroaches, about Jewish supremacists, whatever you want to say, if it's simply in virtue of what it's trying to say, what it's trying to advocate, what it's trying to describe, that's the kind that will probably for the foreseeable future remain protected. So talk about the conditions and the effects that the hate speech is designed to have or designed to make, rather than about what it is advocating or what it is arguing.
Well, I think we'll end there. It's been a terrific afternoon. I want to thank our panelists, Ross, Sarah, and Jeff, for a really timely and important discussion on how anti-Jewish representations and misinformation have been deployed in social media and how we might go about safeguarding some of these. I also want to thank our audience for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at our next Casden event, which will be an actual in-person. There are these in-person events that we used to have. It's going to be at Sinai Temple on Wilshire and Beverly Glen on Sunday, April the 6th, from 6 to 8 p.m., and will feature a panel discussion on the topic of the impact of the housing crisis on the Los Angeles Jewish community and how to make Los Angeles great again for future generations. Thank you all. Have a good evening. And thank you, panelists, again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.